It is just past 2 in the morning when the first storage tank lets go. 1 second the depot is a grid of dark cylinders under a half-moon. The next, a column of fire climbs 300 meters into the night, and the men running from the pump house cast long shadows across the concrete. Hundreds of kilometers behind the front, a Ukrainian operator watches the feed hold steady until the screen fills with white. The drone that did this cost less than a used car. What it destroyed took months to move east, and Russia never saw the corridor it flew. We will come back to that corridor, and to the reason the depot's own air defense stayed silent until the fuel was already alight. But to understand why a single fixed-wing drone mattered this much, you have to start where the night started, not at the depot, at the grid. On the night of July 22, Russia ran the play it has run all year. Waves of cruise missiles and Shahed-type one-way attack drones, the Russians call them Gerun 2, lifted off in coordinated packages and pushed west toward Ukraine's energy nodes. Substations, transformer yards, the switching stations that tie the national grid together. By the time the sirens faded, 8 oblasts had dropped into rolling blackouts. Kharkiv took fresh fire, so did Kherson and Sumy. Across a third of the country, the lights flickered, dimmed, and went out, and the low mechanical growl of diesel generators rose in their place. This was not new. It was the pattern. Hit the grid, wait for the lights to fail, wait for the morale to sag, repeat the next week. Moscow has treated Ukrainian electricity as a nerve to be pinched on a schedule. And on the surface, July 22 looked like another successful pinch. What Russian planners did not account for was that Ukraine's deep strike arm had already spun up. While the Shaheds were still crossing the Dnipro in a darkened operations room far from the front, target coordinates were loading onto screens. Not grid targets, fuel. This was not going to be an even trade of substation for substation. It was going to be something Russia has learned to fear far more. Let us be clear about what this is and what it is not. This was not a one-off act of revenge. It is the latest increment in a campaign that has been running all summer and into autumn. A sustained Ukrainian effort to reach past the front and burn the logistics that keep the invasion moving. Open-source intelligence channels have tracked dozens of strikes on Russian fuel infrastructure across this stretch of the war. Refineries, pumping stations, rail depots, storage farms, shadow fleet tankers offshore. The night of July 22 was one beat inside that longer rhythm. The number that matters here is what burned that night, not the running total, because the running total keeps climbing every week after this video goes live. President Zelensky himself put the confirmation on the record. In his public remarks, he pointed to strikes on Russian logistics centers, an oil depot, and shadow fleet vessels, the tanker traffic that moves Russian crude around sanctions. That gives this story a documented spine. The Ukrainian General Staff's daily reporting tracks the same category of targets, week after week. So when we describe fuel burning behind Russian lines on the night the grid went dark, we are describing a confirmed class of operation, reconstructed here in the detail the cameras and the intercepts imply. Now the geography, because geography is the whole argument. The Russian war machine in Ukraine does not run on courage. It runs on diesel. Every tank that rolls toward Pokrovsk, every self-propelled gun that shells Kherson, every truck that hauls shells to the Kupiansk axis, every generator powering a command bunker, all of it drinks fuel that started its journey at a refinery deep inside Russia and moved east by rail and road to forward depots. Those depots are the heart valves of the invasion. Squeeze one and everything downstream slows. And here is the asymmetry that defines this entire chapter of the war. A Shahed drone flying west to hit a Ukrainian transformer is not free. Neither is the diesel that fuels the trucks that move the missiles that hit the grid. Every one of those systems is downstream of a fuel tank sitting in a storage yard somewhere in Russia's rear. Burn the tank and you have not just destroyed diesel. You have destroyed every sortie that diesel would have enabled. You have reached forward in time and canceled next week's blackout before it launches. That is the logic the operators in that darkened room were working from. Not eye for an eye. Root instead of branch. The fastest way to blunt the next wave of strikes on Ukrainian cities is not to shoot down Shaheds one at a time over Kiev. It is to burn the fuel before it ever reaches the launch site. The unit that flies these missions works under the Ukrainian General Staff's Deep Strike and Unmanned Systems Directorate. We are not going to name a call sign because the operators do not want one named, and the honest version of this story respects that. What we can describe is the platform. This is not the little quadcopter you have seen dropping grenades into trenches in 10-kilometer fights. That is a different war, a different tool. This is a long-range fixed-wing one-way attack drone, a slender airframe with a small internal combustion engine, wings built for endurance rather than agility, a warhead in the nose, and a camera that streams until the last frame. Range measured not in kilometers but in hundreds of kilometers. Cost measured in the low thousands of dollars, sometimes less. Against a fuel farm worth tens of millions and months of logistics to fill. That is the trade of the century. The men who plan these strikes think in fuel corridors the way a chess player thinks in files and ranks. Where does the rail line offload? Where does the diesel pool before it is trucked forward? Which storage sites feed which axes of the front? A depot that supplies the Pokrovsk direction is worth more than one sitting idle. A full depot is worth more than a half-empty one. Timing matters as much as coordinates. 6 weeks before the July 22 blackout, this same category of operation had already been grinding down Russia's rear. Storage farms hit in the dark. Refinery distillation columns cooking off. Pumping stations knocked out so the fuel could not move even when it survived. The Russians know the campaign is happening. That is the maddening part for their commanders. They know, and they still cannot cover every tank in a country 11 time zones wide. Which brings us to the Russian side of the miscalculation, because every good strike has a bad assumption on the other end of it. The officer responsible for a rear area fuel depot lives by a simple, comfortable belief. Distance is protection. Put enough kilometers between your storage yard and the front line and the drones cannot reach you. That belief was true in 2022. It was mostly true in 2023. By late 2025, it is a fatal habit of mind. The front did not move closer to the depot. The reach of the weapon moved closer to the depot. The lieutenant colonel in charge of a fuel point hundreds of kilometers behind the line still parked his tankers in neat rows, still ran his pumps on a schedule, still assumed the war was somewhere else. The war was inbound at 90 kilometers an hour, and it had a camera. Consider what a fuel depot actually is up close because it explains everything about why the footage looks the way it does. Rows of cylindrical storage tanks, some above ground, some bermed with earth, a pump house, a rail spur where tank cars offload, a truck apron where Kamei's 6,520 tankers back in to fill, jerry cans of diesel and petrol stacked on the escort vehicles, and connecting all of it, a spiderweb of pipes and valves and vapor. A fuel depot is not a hard target in the way a tank is hard. A tank you have to hit precisely, in the right place, to defeat armor. A fuel depot you only have to open. One breach, one spark, one warhead into the right tank, and the site does the rest of the work itself. The secondaries are the weapon, you bring the match. The Russians stored the accelerant. The midsummer intercepts on Russian logistics nets told the story of a system under quiet strain, chatter about deliveries running late, complaints about fuel that was promised and did not arrive, a refueling point that got half the diesel it expected. Half a load is not a counterattack. Every burn depot upstream turns into a tank that sits still downstream, a gun that fires fewer rounds, an assault that steps off an hour late and into Ukrainian artillery. The operators reading those intercepts knew their arithmetic was working. But knowing it is working and putting a warhead through a specific storage tank 300 kilometers away, on the same night the grid is under attack, in a corridor threaded with Russian air defense, that is a different problem. That part came after dusk. The launch window opens when the light dies. Fixed-wing strike drones prefer the dark for the same reason burglars do. The eye that hunts them works worse at night. Along a tree line far from any city, the ground crew works fast and quiet. The airframes come out of their transport cases. Fuel goes in. The nose warheads are already fitted. Someone loads the mission waypoints, the ingress corridor, the aim point on the depot chosen from days of watching. Wings level. Engine catches with a flat insect buzz. The first drone rolls, lifts, and folds into the black sky heading east. The route is not a straight line. It never is. A straight line from launch to target runs through every air defense radar the Russians have bothered to switch on, and the deep strike planners know where most of those are. So the corridor bends. It hugs terrain. It uses the gaps between coverage, the seams where one battery's radar horizon ends and the next has not yet begun. It flies low enough that the curve of the Earth hides it from search radars until it is close, and by the time it is close it is small, cool, and moving. A slender composite airframe with a little piston engine does not light up a screen the way a cruise missile does. That is the entire point of the design. Somewhere along that corridor sits Russian air defense that was built to stop exactly this: Panzer S-1 point defense systems, Tor M2 short-range batteries, the layered net that is supposed to keep the rear. On paper it is formidable. In practice it is spread thin across a country too big to cover, aimed mostly at the routes the Russians expect, and manned by crews who have been on alert for years and have learned that most nights nothing comes. The drone flies through the assumption as much as through the airspace. Remember the depot's own air defense that stayed silent at the top of this story? This is why. By the time anything on that site understood what was crossing the perimeter, the geometry had already been solved. The flight is long and it is boring, and boring is the goal. For the better part of an hour, the operator watches a dark landscape scroll past under the nose camera. Rivers show as black ribbons. Roads show as faint gray threads. A town passes, lights mostly out. And then more dark country. The drone is a patient thing. It does not need to dodge or climb or fight. It needs only to keep flying east until the aim point comes up out of the dark. Halfway through the run, a mid-course waypoint clicks past and the corridor bends again, away from a battery the planners never wanted to test. The screen stays quiet, the engine buzzes on, and a few hundred kilometers behind the front the target begins to resolve. There, low on the horizon, a cluster of pale shapes that do not belong to nature. Regular, geometric cylinders. The storage tanks catch the last of the ambient light and give themselves away by their shape, because nothing in a forest or a field is that round or that evenly spaced. The operator's hands settle. The aim point is one specific tank, chosen because of where it sits in the farm and what is packed around it. This is the moment the whole chain has been building toward: the rail line, the trucks, the corridor, the hour of dark flight. It comes down to putting a nose through the skin of one steel cylinder. The last kilometer goes fast. The depot swells in the frame from a distant cluster to a wall of tanks filling the screen. Now you can see detail. The berms, the pipe runs, a single vehicle parked near the pump house, a figure or two that should not be out at this hour and hour. The drone does not slow. There is no slowing in this kind of attack. The operator makes the smallest corrections, holding the aim point dead center as the target rushes up. 500 meters. The tank fills the frame. 200. 100. The steel skin, the weld seams, the faint sheen of the paint. Then the feed goes white and the telemetry stops, and that white is the answer to everything. For a heartbeat there is nothing but the last frozen frame and the loss of signal. Then from a second drone holding wider, or from the reconnaissance asset watching the whole farm, the picture returns and it is transformed. Where the aim point was, there is now a fireball climbing into the night, and the shockwave is already crossing the site. This is where the depot becomes its own weapon. The first tank does not burn alone. Ruptured fuel sprays, ignites, and the heat reaches the next tank and the next. Secondary detonations ripple across the storage farm in a chain, each one a fresh column of fire, each one throwing burning fuel across the berms to start the next. A single warhead becomes a dozen fires, becomes one continuous roar of flame that lights the clouds orange from below. Inside the depot, the reaction is the reaction of men who genuinely did not believe this could happen to them. The pump house crew scatters. Somebody tries to reach a valve and cannot get near it for the heat. There is no organized firefight because there is nothing to fight. The enemy already left, hundreds of kilometers to the west, watching on a screen. What is left is fire and physics. A fuel depot fire does not get put out by brave men with hoses. It burns until the fuel is gone. The men who ran the pumps understand this in the first 30 seconds and they run. Not all of them run in time. Near the point of impact, the crew that had been working the apron did not survive the first detonation. A fuel farm at the moment of ignition is not a place a human body walks out of. That is the plain accounting of it, and it is the accounting the Russian officer who parked his tankers in neat rows had a duty to prevent and did not. By the time the fire reaches its full height, the storage farm is a lake of flame visible for tens of kilometers. Satellite passes in the days after a strike like this show the signature clearly. Scorched circles where tanks used to stand, the ground stained black, the neat geometry of the depot replaced by ash and twisted steel. Planet Labs and Maxar imagery has documented exactly this pattern across the campaign: before, a tidy grid of cylinders; after, a burn scar. You do not need an intercept to read it. The Earth keeps the receipt. The intercepts come anyway, and they tell the human shape of the loss. On Russian logistics nets in the hours after, the chatter is confusion first, then damage assessment, then the grim math of what is gone. A depot's worth of diesel does not evaporate on a spreadsheet. It evaporates from the front. The units that were supposed to draw from that site now draw from farther away, over longer roads, through the same drone corridors that just proved they are open. The lieutenant colonel in charge, if he survived, spends his morning explaining to a superior why distance did not protect him. There is no good answer to that question anymore. Now the accounting, because this is where the strike stops being a fireworks show and starts being strategy. A long-range, fixed-wing strike drone of this class costs somewhere in the low thousands to the low tens of thousands of dollars. Call it the price of a modest used car at the high end. What it destroyed is measured differently. A fuel depot holds hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions, of liters of diesel and petrol. Every liter had to be refined, then railed hundreds of kilometers, then stored, then guarded. The dollar value of the fuel alone runs into the millions. The strategic value is higher, and it is the number that actually matters. Every liter that burned in that farm is a liter that will never reach a tank, a truck, a generator, or a Shahed launch crew on the front. Run the chain forward. The Jaran 2 drones that darkened 8 Oblasts on July 22 were trucked to their launch sites. Those trucks ran on diesel. The crews that assembled and fueled and launched them were supplied by depots like the one now burning. Knock out the fuel and you do not stop one Shahed. You degrade the whole tempo of the campaign against Ukraine's grid. This is the answer to the blackout that is worth more than shooting down drones over Kiev one by one. Ukraine did not try to outdefend the July 22 strike. It reached behind it and pulled a supporting beam out of the structure. That is the contrast at the center of this whole night, and it is worth saying plainly. Russia bet, again, that hammering Ukraine's electrical grid would break Ukrainian will, that enough dark nights and cold apartments would do what the army on the ground could not. It is a bet Moscow has been placing and losing since the first winter of the full-scale invasion. The lights go out, the generators come on, the grid crews go back out in the dark and patch what they can, and the country does not break. And on the same night the missiles fly west, the drones fly east, and a piece of the machine that launched those missiles turns to ash in a field it thought was safe. Consider the two ledgers side by side. Russia expends cruise missiles worth $1 million apiece and Shaheds worth tens of thousands each to damage transformers that Ukrainian crews, backed by Western spare parts, will have partially back online within days. Ukraine expends an airframe worth a fraction of one Shahed to erase a fuel stockpile that took months to build and cannot be replaced within days. One side is trading expensive weapons for temporary darkness. The other is trading cheap weapons for permanent subtraction from the enemy's fuel supply. Over a summer and an autumn of this, the ledgers do not converge. They spread apart. The Russian answer to the campaign has been to try to push its fuel farther back, disperse its storage, harden what it can, and thicken the air defense over the rear. All of it costs. Dispersing fuel means more, smaller sites, which means more trucks moving more often over longer routes, more targets, not fewer. Pulling Pantsir and Tor batteries back to guard depots means fewer of them forward, where the Ukrainian army also wants them gone. Every defensive move Russia makes to protect its fuel is a resource it cannot spend attacking. The deep strike campaign does not just burn diesel. It bends the entire shape of Russia's rear, and it makes the country's vast size, always sold as its great strategic advantage, into a liability, because a big country is a country full of things too far apart to all be guarded at once. And here is the callback the whole story has been carrying. The depot's own air defense that stayed silent at the very beginning, the reason was never one clever trick. It was the accumulation of every choice the planners made. The corridor that bent around the batteries, the low ingress that hid under the radar horizon, the small cool airframe that barely registered, the dark hour chosen because tired crews expect nothing. Distance was supposed to be the protection. Distance was the vulnerability. The depot was too far back to be defended like the front and too important to be left undefended, and it fell into the gap between those two facts. The corridor from the top of this story, the one Russia never saw, is the real weapon here, more than any single airframe. Because a corridor, once proven, gets used again. What flew that route on the night of July 22 can fly it again next week, and the week after, until the Russians move everything of value out of reach, and there is no out of reach anymore. That is what it means when the deep strike arm reaches deeper than ever into the supply chain. It is not one fire. It is a demonstration that the fires can happen anywhere the fuel is, on any night Ukraine chooses. So count the real cost of the night Russia blacked out 8 oblasts. Moscow got a few dark cities that were lit again within days. Ukraine got a fuel depot's worth of diesel removed from the war for good, a corridor confirmed open, and a reminder mailed to every Russian logistics officer that neat rows of tankers hundreds of kilometers behind the line are not safe and will not be safe again. The invader who parked his fuel where he thought the war could not reach learned that the line of which kilometer is safe has moved. And the defenders are the ones who keep moving it. Russia traded a blackout for an inferno. In the arithmetic of this war, that is not a trade Moscow can keep making. Every leader that never reaches the front is a Shahed that never flies. And the drones fly east tonight too.